Hi, 18 Cinema Summary here. Today we're going to do a recap of the film The Girl Next Door. This is a psychological drama film about a boy who faces true inhumanity for the first time in his life. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The film starts with a man named David, who's leaving his office and listening to voicemails. He passes by an old homeless man, but right then, he hears a loud noise behind him. A car has run over the old man, and it's speeding away. The man is taken to the hospital while David goes back home. He explains that even though he's a rich Wall Street banker with a good life, he feels pain in his heart. He even wishes that it was him instead of the old man who got run over by that car. He's drinking as he opens an envelope that has a watercolor painting inside. This painting reminds him of his childhood in the late 1950s. David calls that time a strange era when people were way more secretive and rougher in their treatment. As he stares at the painting, he starts having a flashback. It's the summer of 1958, and David is catching crayfish at a nearby stream. While he's catching crayfish, a girl comes there and asks him what he's doing. David explains that he's catching crayfish to just look at them. The girl introduces herself as Meg, and she starts looking at all the crayfish in the jar. She's fascinated by them, and David asks her to try, and that's when he notices a scar on her arm. Meg says that her family got into an accident, and she and her sister are the only survivors. Right then, she catches a big crayfish, and she's really happy about it. She tells David to release them after he's done with them and leaves. David asks her where she's staying, and she says with her Aunt Ruth. Ruth is David's neighbor, and he spends a lot of his time at her house. She has 3 sons, and she's a single mom taking care of all of them. David meets up with Ruth's son Donnie, who explains how Meg and her little sister Susan live with them. The boys walk around town, meeting up with their other friends and play their customary summer game. This game involves one person who is blindfolded while the other people hide. The blind person has to find the other people and hit them with an apple. After hitting someone, they have to get to a safe zone, but if they're caught, they are interrogated. The kids are being rough in their game, and David isn't enjoying it. In the evening, he goes to the carnival where he sees Meg, and he asks her if she wants to go on the Ferris wheel with him. She likes these rides, and she agrees to go with him. On the Ferris wheel, Meg tells David that her parents always wanted to go to a theme park, but they never got the chance. David asks her if she would like to go again on the Ferris wheel, but Meg has to be home early because of Ruth. The next day, all the kids are sitting in the living room of Ruth's house. She's a very careless woman who allows her underage kids to drink beer. She then takes the boys to the carnival for ice cream, but asks Meg to stay home and look after her sister. That night, the boys are looking at adult magazines and talking about girls when they decide to spy on Meg. 2 boys climb a tree and are peeping on Meg, but she turns the light off in her room. The next day, Ruth asks everyone to burn the moth nests in her lawn, but Meg doesn't want to do it. This makes Ruth angry, and she lashes out at Meg. The same evening, David is buying a cheeseburger when Meg asks him for some money, because she hasn't eaten in 2 days. David buys her some food, and she tells him that Ruth doesn't allow her to eat. In fact, she doesn't allow her to do anything. She tells David that she likes to make watercolor paintings, and David asks her to make one for him. The next day, he sees Ruth getting angry at Susan, who has to use walking aids just even to stand up. Then one day, Meg brings her watercolor painting of him catching crayfish. That evening, David goes to Ruth and shows her the painting. For some reason, Ruth doesn't like it, and she starts telling her children that women are too easy these days. She says that if a boy is nice to a girl, she will do anything for him. She even mentions David's dad, who is a popular womanizer. Then she talks about her husband, who ran with some other woman. She insults Meg and tells her that if she tries to seduce a guy, she will have to pay for it. That night, David wakes up and sees Ruth and Meg fighting over something. The next morning, he goes to their house and sees the boys tickling Meg, who is asking everyone to stop, and eventually, she shoves a boy away. She leaves the room, but pretty soon, Ruth comes inside, and she starts talking to Susan. She tells Susan that she will have to pay for her sister's bad behavior. So, Ruth starts to beat Susan up, and Meg comes into the room and begs her to stop. David is upset at all of this, but Ruth tells him not to mention it to anyone. A couple of days later, Donnie and David see Meg talking to a police officer. That evening, Ruth is sitting with everyone in the living room when her eldest son Willie slaps Meg for talking to a police officer. Ruth tells Meg that she is fed up with her. She doesn't want Meg to be talking to anyone anymore. So, she tells everyone to leave her alone while she thinks about what to do with Meg. The next evening, David is asked to stay the night at Ruth's place. He gets permission from his father and goes there in the evening. He walks into the basement where Ruth and her children are punishing Meg. They have hung her from her hands, and Ruth allows them to disrobe her. They're mistreating Meg, and Ruth decides to leave her down there for the night. At night, all the boys are talking about Meg's body, and they want to see her again. The next morning, David enters the basement to see Ruth trying to feed Meg, who looks really sick. She can't eat anything, and this makes Ruth very angry. Ruth grabs Susan and decides to punish her for Meg's behavior. David feels extremely bad about all of this, so the next day, he goes to his father's bar. While helping out his father, David asks him if it is okay to hit a girl. His father doesn't understand what David means, but he says that no one should ever hurt a woman. The next day, David goes to Ruth's house, and he tells Susan that he will help them in any way he can. He also sees other kids beating up Meg really badly that day. That night, David can't sleep anymore, and he wants to tell everything to his parents, but they are sleeping, and they don't listen to him. The next morning, he goes to see Meg, who is being tormented by Ruth's kids. They are slashing her with knives, and Ruth is burning her skin with cigarettes. This is when the police officer from earlier decides to pay them a visit. So, Ruth goes upstairs and talks to the officer, who says that some kids were talking about how they beat Meg up every day. Ruth says that Meg is just out shopping, and that she is okay. Meanwhile, David tries to comfort her. A few days later, he sneaks into the basement and talks to Meg. He gives her some money that he has saved up and tells her that he will leave the basement door open for her. She asks him to hide the money under the big rock near the creek, and David leaves after giving her a small knife. The next day, he goes to the house where Donnie takes him to the basement. In the basement, all the kids are present, and Willie is forcing himself on Meg while Ruth is watching all of this. She tells everyone that this is what a bad girl like Meg deserves. She has gone completely insane, and her children have become total psychopaths as well. Her youngest child tells her that they should cut Meg's body, so that no man will ever want her. David wants to leave, but Donnie doesn't allow him. Ruth is still not satisfied, so she decides to use a blowtorch to burn Meg's genitals. By this point, David has had enough. He tries to run and get some help from Meg, but Ruth and her children grab him and tie him up as well. He witnesses as Ruth burns Meg's body, and he passes out. When he wakes up, he cuts off the ropes around his hands and checks on Meg, who is badly injured. Susan tells him that it's all because of her. Meg had managed to escape, but she was caught again because trying to save Susan. David knows that they can't stay in that basement because Meg will pretty soon die from her injuries. He starts up a fire inside the basement using some cotton. The smoke gets out of the basement and into the street, and Donnie also notices it. Ruth goes down to the basement to stop the fire, but David hits her with a walking stick. Willie and Donnie try to stop David, but the police arrive there. They take Susan out of the basement while Meg and Ruth die because of their injury. And that wraps up our recap for the movie The Girl Next Door. Feel free to drop a comment below as to what we should recap next. Thank you for watching.